Hello and welcome, folks. Wizuko here. Okay, let me chicken out a little. I'm not here to shit on Final Fantasy. In fact, I think that both series are good. I just think that Final Fantasy used to be better and is slowly losing my interest, while the Tales of games are getting better and better. But at the end of the day, I'm comparing gold to a diamond. The diamond is better, rarer, and arguably prettier. But that doesn't mean gold is trash and has no value anymore. And if you prefer Final Fantasy more, well then more power to you. I can't say that I understand you, but that's the whole point of the video, right? So with that said, let's get back to my real point. Today, I want to compare Final Fantasy and the Tales of series. And I want to tell you why I think, if you like JRPGs that is, you should go for a Tales of game rather than a Final Fantasy. I want to compare the stories, graphics, gameplay, and how the series progressed as a whole, and show you why I think that Tales of games are just better than Final Fantasy ones. And if you don't agree, well, feel free to change my mind. Story. Oh boy, what did I get myself into? You see, both Tales of, as well as the Final Fantasy series, don't really connect their games with each other all that much. I mean, yeah, there is the occasional direct sequel and traditions that are referenced in every game of the series, but the story of Tales of Vesperia shares next to nothing with Tales of Symphonia. And the same goes for Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XV, for example. Plus, there is a lot of subjectivity when it comes to stories. I personally like when stories can combine action, romance, and philosophical elements with each other. Others don't. That doesn't make the story better per se, it might just be more likable for a certain group of people. So, how can we compare the story of those two game series? Well, let's talk about the elements of storytelling that can be found in both game series, and compare those. Both Final Fantasy and Tales of have a very similar way of structuring their stories. Each game starts with their main character in their natural habitat, giving us a glimpse of their everyday life. Then tragedy strikes and a journey begins that at the start seems like an easy task, something very manageable, but slowly evolves into a worldwide issue, which was foreshadowed by a mystery that followed you the entire game, but never seemed that important until it suddenly was. It sounds dumb when you break it open like that, but I tell you, this structure works every freaking time. The way the games use these structures, though, is quite different. In Tales of games, for example, you'd usually start very peaceful in your hometown. Your main character is often a nobody and would stumble across someone who would drag him into this whole mess. In the game series, there are variants, of course. Sometimes you're not a nobody, sometimes the other character won't drag you into this, but rather save you from something. But it's very evident that most Tales of games use this formula in some way. In Final Fantasy, however, there is this trend ever since Final Fantasy VII, I think, that you start in action. You get a cutscene showing you how your everyday life would have been like, but today something escalated and you have either been part of the reason why things get chaotic, or you'll be dragged into it, getting you in the action very early into the game. So while the start is already very similar, you can clearly see that Tales of is more of a slow starter. And I think that makes the series already a bit better for me, because there is this feeling that only Tales of games can give me. And the start of the game is key here. Let me explain. Very typical for Tales of games is that just before you attack the big evil super end boss, you'll visit your hometown one more time. And that feeling you get returning to the place where your most important main quest was to pick flowers or grab a watering can for a neighbor is weirdly nostalgic. You feel right at home again. And as funny as it sounds, you start really reflecting how far you've come for a couple of moments. And you just have this indescribable feeling. And I'm totally here for that. And so I think that Final Fantasy totally misses out on that starting right in action right away. Giving us the impression that our character was badass from the start anyway leaves less room for improvement and growth, thus making this nostalgic and reflecting less likely to happen, since being badass from the beginning leaves not much room for improvement and growth. Not to say that Final Fantasy characters wouldn't grow at all, I'm just saying that it doesn't feel as significant. And more often than not, Final Fantasy doesn't seem too keen on giving us non-badass sort of characters at the start of the game. But that's not all the stories of these incredible games have to offer. However, the rest is very hard to compare, because, for example, the romance aspect doesn't really have a formula throughout the entire game series, neither in the Final Fantasy games nor in the Tales of games. So I'll go more into detail when it comes to story when we'll talk about how the game progressed, because there we are going to compare some specific titles with each other. Graphics. Okay, listen, I love the Final Fantasy style. It's magical, it's bombastic, and I'm very thankful they did what they did, because they were and still are pushing technology to create stunning images. However, you cannot deny that the stronger stylized and more anime-esque cel shading approach doesn't have its charm. And I also think there is one big benefit to it. Cel shading graphics don't quite age as fast as this more realistic graphic approach does. I think it still looks pretty good. And in a few years, I can still imagine playing this game exactly how it looks right now. It's not high definition or anything, but you can see what things are. And with more realistic graphics, that's not always the case. Besides, I just personally really like the more stylized approach. I feel like everything has more meaning to it, exactly because of its lack of realism. The expressions are more intense, and I just really like it. As a person who loves to analyze things and maybe even overdoes that from time to time, I feel like such stylized graphic styles give me more of an argument to really do what I do. The gameplay. That is the most interesting topic, I feel.
Because the biggest difference between the Tales of series and Final Fantasy is basically the battle system. While Final Fantasy was always trying to do a more strategic approach with their round-based battle system, the Tales of series try to do more of an action-based battle system kind of approach thing.
And I have to admit, I always thought that Tales of pulled off their battle systems better. Final Fantasy fans are still upset to this very day about the more hack and slay sort of gameplay they introduced. And especially Final Fantasy XIII, to me, was a big mistake when it comes to battles. I mean, don't get me wrong, the battles are beautiful to look at, very nicely animated, cool effects, epic, but the battles were awfully boring. Aside from those fancy animations, the battle system had nothing to offer. Most of the time it felt like button mashing, and the other half kind of felt like I did not put any input in at all. And yeah, strategy was still kinda important-ish, and you had to make a plan to defeat stronger enemies, I guess. But I never really thought they were really rewarding. Plus, at the end of the day, I just didn't get from the game what I wanted. Final Fantasy was as good and as amazing as it was exactly because of its brilliantly strategic battle system. No one pulled it off as good as they did. And now turning their back on the more strategic side of battles, only to make it more exciting, kind of felt like a step backwards, as if they themselves didn't know what people really liked about the battle systems. And still, to this day, I think Square Enix didn't pull off a good jump from one battle system to the next, while Tales of was celebrated celebrated for it. They just straight up went there and just pulled off a beat-em-up system with their own battle system. And since they started very early, I think it made it just work. The gameplay feels much more rewarding, and I feel like I've won because I did very well, not just because of luck, like I did feel with Final Fantasy very often. Especially when it comes to Final Fantasy XV, I did enjoy the battles. I don't want to say that all battles are bad or something, but I just think that Final Fantasy battle systems, when you try to explain them or when you look up guides, they are quickly overcomplicated and yet not really all that interesting after all. In Final Fantasy, battles feel more like a nuisance, while in the Tales of games, battles are actually pretty fun. They're not very hard, they're not very challenging, but they can be. They're easy to get into and hard to master, and I think that's where Final Fantasy really lacks. However, gameplay is not just the battle system, and there were some similarities. Both started as rather linear, very story-centered games, until both evolved more and more open world. And speaking of evolving, Evolvement. Looking at all this in a vacuum doesn't make too much sense, does it? There are better and not that great games among both sides. I didn't enjoy Tales of Graces as much as I enjoyed Final Fantasy VII, but I enjoyed Tales of Symphonia by far more than Final Fantasy XIII or XV. But that's the thing. When I talk about Final Fantasy with glowing bright eyes and admiration, I'm talking about Final Fantasy X, VII, 3, so basically very old Final Fantasy games. But then when I talk about my favorite Tales of games, I talk about Vesperia, XIII, or Zestria, all of them being more and more recent. The new Tales of Arise, that I'm also streaming at the moment, looks absolutely stunning, and I enjoy every minute playing it. Sure, storytelling-wise, it changed a lot of things I'd usually come to love about the Tales of games, but it also makes me curious, and I really hope the game keeps up the good impression. Change is not necessarily always bad, only if you change something that worked and was good into something that is not good and does not work. So I want to see where that leads. And I'm thankful for that feeling because both Final Fantasy XIII and Final Fantasy XV had my hopes high up. But it was soon that I was forcing myself to play. I thought the games were very surface level when it comes to the storytelling, and the characters were forgettable. With Final Fantasy XV, I had a bad start because I didn't quite like the boy band approach, but I was genuinely giving the game a chance. And while the gameplay was fun from time to time, it felt misplaced, and the story didn't manage to make me curious or even care for that matter. Again, I'm not saying the game is trash, I'm just saying that I'm a very emotional person that is actually very easy to catch and very positive about gaming in general, but somehow the last two Final Fantasy couldn't do any of this. They couldn't make me emotional. They couldn't catch my interest. While Tales of games have me in awe within a couple of minutes. What I feel is this disconnect from Final Fantasy. The Final Fantasy boy band from 15 had no qualities that I could relate to. They felt more of caricatures of character tropes than real people. And I'm not saying that because they were men. In Final Fantasy X, I had no problem connecting with Tidus, who is also the male protagonist. But he was a complex character that changed, evolved, and we really got to know him. While Noctis was... I don't even know what he was. I couldn't characterize him without looking him up. He already looks very generic. I mean, look at him and tell me that you have never seen that design before. He looks like any anime emo boy ever. Tidus was arrogant, but kind. A little dumb, but in a sincere way. He was funny relief, serious romance protagonist, an action hero. But you wouldn't know that at the start. You had to get to know him, much like the more complex characters of the more recent Tales of games. And I think at the center of a story is the characters. If I cannot even remember the characters anymore after I've finished the game, then what is even the point? The characters are what make me buy merchandise. The characters are
are what make me think about the game, what make me want to continue the game. The characters are who really get me invested, and that's why they're so important. And recently, Final Fantasy is not doing that for me, and that's my entire point. Tales of games are improving. The characters are getting more and more complex, from at the beginning some character who was just out there for revenge and the typical anime hero that just wanted to protect everyone, who was pretty much just a character trope, to very complex characters with a lot of different character traits that might not even seem to get along all that well, but still manages to make a coherent character. Tales of games are improving, while Final Fantasy is declining. And that's why I think Tales of games are better, because if you stop getting better, you stop being good. But what do you think? Do you agree? Or do you think Final Fantasy has saved its place as the top of JRPGs because of its past successful games? Let me know in the comments down below what you think. And a little extra, give me your top 5 most favorite Final Fantasy or Tales of games. I'm curious what you guys are playing. If you want to join me playing some more, you can join me over at Twitch. I stream every Saturday over there. And when it comes to YouTube, you can expect new gaming related videos every Wednesday. I would love to see you again. So until then, have it good. Bye!